maid's daughter saved a billionaire's son from a raging school fire. She risked everything. But when the smoke cleared, his father's reaction stunned everyone. At Davenport Academy, where marble hallways and money masked every flaw, disaster struck in the most unexpected way. "It's nothing," someone muttered. "Just another false alarm." But it wasn't. Within minutes, smoke swallowed the West Wing. Students poured out into the perfect blue sky, everyone except one, Ethan Davenport, the 17-year-old son of billionaire Richard Davenport. In the chaos, he was left behind, trapped as the fire closed in. The only person who noticed was the maid's daughter, Abigail Foster, the quiet girl no one was supposed to see. While the crowd fled, she turned back, running into the flames. In those smoke-filled corridors, choices were made that no child should ever have to face. What started as a normal day in a library ended as a desperate fight for survival inside a burning school. This is the story of how a forgotten girl became impossible to ignore when silence met fire and everything changed. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The smell of burning plastic was the first sign that perfection had a price. 12-year-old Abigail Foster sat alone in the library, a place so quiet you could hear the dust settle. Outside these hallowed walls, a boy's future was about to be decided not by his father's wealth, but by the forgotten lessons of a long-dead soldier. The Davenport Academy was less a school and more a monument to success. Its marble hallways gleamed under recessed lighting. The air itself seemed filtered, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ambition. Every student who walked these corridors was the child of someone important. They wore their privilege like a uniform, a shield against the untidy realities of the world. Abigail Foster, known to most as Abby, had no such shield. She was an anomaly, a ghost in the machine. Her uniform was the simple, clean dress her mother insisted she wear. Her presence was tolerated for one reason only. Her mother, Carol Foster, was the head housekeeper. While the children of Titans learned about stock portfolios and hostile takeovers, Carol moved through the academy with quiet efficiency. She erased the smudges of privilege from glass doors and wiped the dust from books that were rarely opened. And Abby, after her own school day ended at the public middle school across town, would come here. She would find a forgotten corner in the cavernous library and do her homework until her mother's shift was over. She was instructed to be invisible, and most days, she succeeded. Today, she wasn't doing homework. She held a small, worn book in her lap. It was a leather-bound journal, its corners frayed and its pages the color of old ivory. It did not belong in this library of pristine, unread classics. This book had been read 1,000 times. Its spine was soft and yielding, a testament to a life of use. It was the journal of her great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael O'Connell. He had fought in a war long before she was born, in a muddy, faraway place. The journal wasn't about battles or medals. It was about seeing. She traced a line of his faded, precise script with her finger. "The loudest noise on the battlefield is not the explosion," he had written. "It is the silence that comes right before. Fear lives in that silence. But if you listen closer, opportunity lives there too." A shadow fell over her page. Abby looked up. Ethan Davenport stood there, flanked by 2 other boys who orbited him like moons. At 17, Ethan was the undisputed king of the academy. He had his father's sharp jawline and cold, dismissive eyes. He looked at the worn journal in Abby's hands with a faint, contemptuous smirk. "Is that a book or a placemat?" Ethan asked. His friends snickered on cue. Abby felt a familiar flush of heat on her cheeks. She closed the journal gently, as if shielding it from his gaze. "It's a book," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever it is, you're in my seat," Ethan said. He didn't mean the specific chair she occupied. He meant the library, the school, the world. Abby gathered her things without a word. Her mother's first rule was simple: never cause trouble. Especially not with him. Ethan was the son of Richard Davenport, the man who owned this school, the building, and perhaps the very air within it. Arguing with Ethan was like arguing with a hurricane. You just got out of the way. As she moved to a less comfortable chair in the corner, she watched him. He wasn't a simple bully. She had seen him in moments when he thought no one was looking. She saw the tension in his shoulders, The way he constantly checked his phone as if waiting for a verdict. His father's approval was a currency he was perpetually trying to earn, and it was always in short supply. Today seemed worse than usual. He slumped into the chair she had vacated, pulled out his phone, and his face hardened. He was staring at an email. An academic alert. Physics. Grade F. Ethan's friends saw the look on his face and shuffled away, sensing the shift in the weather. He was alone now, stewing in a silent fury. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his knuckles white. Abby knew that look. It wasn't the anger of a boy who failed a test. It was the fear of a boy who had to report that failure to a man like Richard Davenport. It was then that she smelled it. A faint, unnatural scent. It wasn't the floor polish or the old paper of the books. It was sharp, acrid, like a toy left too close to a heater. She looked around. No one else seemed to notice. The librarian was typing, her face illuminated by her computer screen. A few other students were lost in their own worlds, headphones on, eyes on their laptops. Abby wrinkled her nose. The smell was growing stronger. It was the smell of wrongness. Her great-grandfather's words echoed in her mind. Trouble rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It whispers. You must learn to listen for the whisper. She stood up and walked quietly toward the library's main doors. In the gleaming hallway, the smell was more pronounced. She followed it, her sneakers silent on the polished marble. The scent led her away from the main concourse, toward the academy's older, less used west wing. This part of the building was a relic. It housed old music rooms and dusty archives. It was scheduled for renovation next year, a project Richard Davenport kept postponing. An unnecessary expense, he'd called it. As she rounded a corner, she saw a thin, gray wisp of smoke curl from beneath the door of Music Room C. It was a lazy, almost playful curl of smoke, but it made the breath catch in her throat. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned and ran back toward the library. Fire, she yelled, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast hallway. The librarian looked up, her expression one of annoyance, not alarm. Young lady, there is no shouting in the library. But there's smoke, Abby insisted, pointing down the hall. In the west wing. The librarian sighed, a sound of profound weariness. It's the third time this month. The wiring in that wing is faulty. It trips the sensors. Maintenance has been notified. She turned back to her screen, dismissing the whisper of trouble as a known, manageable annoyance. Abby stood frozen. This felt different. The smell wasn't just electrical. It was thicker now, hotter. Just then, the fire alarm chirped. It was a pathetic, half-hearted sound, not the deafening shriek it was supposed to be. It beeped once, twice, and then fell silent. A collective groan went through the library. Another false alarm. No one moved. But Abby's senses were screaming. The air was changing. It was growing heavier, warmer. She looked back down the long, empty corridor toward the west wing. A flicker of orange light danced under the door of the music room. It wasn't a faulty sensor. It was real. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the quiet hum of the academy. It was a deep, hungry whoosh, like a giant beast taking its first breath. The lights in the hallway flickered and died, plunging the corridor into a dim, eerie twilight lit only by the emergency signs. Panic, a cold and contagious thing, finally erupted. Students began to shout. Chairs scraped against the floor. The stampede began. Abby was swept up in the tide of bodies flooding toward the main entrance. The air filled with screams and the smell of fear. She was pushed and shoved, a small boat in a violent sea. She made it outside onto the manicured lawn, gasping for the clean, cool air. The crowd of students and teachers huddled together, their faces pale with shock, their eyes fixed on the west wing. The smoke was no longer a wisp. It was a thick, black pillar, churning into the perfect blue sky. Flames, bright and savage, were now licking at the windows of the second floor. She scanned the crowd, her heart pounding. She saw the librarian, her face a mask of horror. She saw Ethan's friends, their usual arrogance replaced by a raw, naked fear. But she didn't see Ethan. She remembered the look on his face in the library. The fury, the fear. He wouldn't have followed the crowd. He would have gone somewhere to be alone, to escape, to hide. Abby's mind raced. Where would he go? The West Wing. The old, forgotten part of the school. A place to be invisible. She remembered seeing him storm out of the library just before the alarm had failed, his face like a thundercloud. He had turned left, toward the west wing, toward the fire. No one else knew. No one else had seen him. In the chaos, he was just one student, unaccounted for. They wouldn't realize he was missing for precious, life-altering minutes. He was in there, trapped. Her mother's voice was a frantic mantra in her head. Stay safe. Don't cause trouble. Stay out of the way. But her great-grandfather's voice was a deeper, calmer current. In a moment of crisis, there are two kinds of people: those who run away from the fire, and those who run toward the chaos to find who is left behind. The choice you make defines you. The crowd was a wall of backs, all facing away from the burning building. Sirens wailed in the distance, still too far away. Abby looked at the panicked faces around her, then back at the school. The fire was growing, consuming the old, dry wood of the west wing with a terrifying speed. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to stay safe. But all she could see was a boy's face, not of a bully, but of someone who was lost and scared, trapped in a cage of his father's making. Now he was in a real cage, one of fire and smoke. She took a deep breath, the smoke stinging her throat. She slipped away from the edge of the crowd, her small frame going unnoticed in the pandemonium. While the whole world was running away from the fire, Abby Foster turned and ran back toward it. The main entrance was impassable, choked with smoke. She knew another way. Her mother had shown her the service corridors, the hidden arteries of the great building. She ducked behind a row of sculpted hedges and found the steel door used by the kitchen staff. It was unlocked. She pulled it open and slipped inside, into the heart of the crisis. The air inside was thick and hot, a monster's breath. The power was out, and the only light came from the red emergency signs, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The distant roar of the fire was louder here, a constant, menacing growl. The building groaned around her, the sound of a living thing in pain. Her lungs burned. Her eyes watered. Every part of her wanted to turn back. She thought of Ethan, not the arrogant king of the school, but the boy with fear in his eyes. She thought of her great-grandfather, a man who walked into danger not because he was fearless, but because he believed some things were more important than fear. Don't look at the obstacle, his journal had said. Look for the path. There is always a path. Abby moved forward, deeper into the smoke-filled halls. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was a gear, turning against the full force of its destructive power, on a desperate search for one lost soul. The fire raged above, but down here, in the suffocating darkness, the real test had just begun. She had to find him. She had to get him out. Time was running out, measured in breaths and heartbeats, each one more precious than the last. The steel door clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality that sealed her in with the growing disaster. The service corridor was narrow, a stark contrast to the grand hallways of the academy. Here, there were no polished marble floors or recessed lighting. Just bare concrete walls and a single line of emergency lights casting a sickly red glow on the exposed pipes that snaked along the ceiling. The air was a thick, toxic soup. It scraped at the back of her throat and made her eyes stream with tears. Abby pulled the collar of her dress up over her nose and mouth. It was a flimsy filter, but it was better than nothing. She forced herself to take slow, shallow breaths, just as her mother had taught her to do when the fumes from the industrial cleaning supplies became too strong. Stay calm. Panic is a thief. It steals your breath and your sense. She moved deeper into the labyrinth. The roar of the fire was a constant companion, a predator circling just out of sight. Sometimes it was a low growl that vibrated through the soles of her sneakers. Other times it was a sharp crackle, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. The building was speaking a language of destruction, and Abby was the only one listening. She reached a junction in the corridor. One way led toward the kitchens, the other sloped down toward the boiler room before connecting to the West Wing's basement. She knew this route. She had sometimes followed her mother this way, a secret path through the school's hidden skeleton. She took the path toward the West Wing. The air grew hotter with every step. The red emergency lights became less reliable, flickering as if struggling to hold on to life. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Her great-grandfather's journal, a passage she had read just last night. In the dark, you have two choices. You can curse the blackness, or you can become a creature of the night. You can learn to see with your hands, to hear with your skin. Your body knows the way. You just have to trust it. She reached out, her fingers trailing along the cool, rough concrete of the wall. This became her guide. The wall was her map in the growing darkness. She kept one hand on it at all times, a lifeline in the suffocating gloom. The smoke was thicker here, a living entity that coiled around her ankles and swirled in front of her face. She began to cough, a series of dry, racking heaves that shook her small frame. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. It would be so easy to turn back, so easy to run back to the clean air and the blue sky. But the image of Ethan's face, pale and strained in the library, was burned into her mind. He was in here somewhere. Alone. She pushed forward. The corridor opened into the basement of the West Wing. The roar of the fire was directly above her now. The ceiling shuddered. A fine layer of dust and ash rained down, coating her blonde hair in a film of gray. She could see the base of a staircase through the smoky haze, leading up into the inferno. It was the only way to the music rooms. Taking a deep breath that was more smoke than air, she started to climb. The heat intensified with each step, pressing in on her from all sides. The ornate wooden banister was hot to the touch. Halfway up, a section of the ceiling groaned, buckled, and then collapsed onto the landing just ahead of her. A shower of sparks and burning debris rained down, blocking her path. Abby scrambled back, her heart leaping into her throat. Trapped. The thought was a sudden, cold terror. The fire was above her, and now it was in front of her. She looked back down the stairs, but the smoke was a boiling, impenetrable wall. She was cut off. Panic began its insidious work, constricting her chest, shortening her breath. Her vision swam. This is it. I'm going to die here. Then, another voice cut through the noise in her head. A calm, steady voice from the pages of the journal. Fear is a liar. It tells you there is no way out. But fear is not the architect of the world. It did not build the walls. It cannot predict the path. Look again. Always look again. Abby forced her eyes open, blinking against the sting of the smoke. She looked at the pile of burning rubble. It was a wall of fire, yes. But to the side, near the wall, there was a gap. A small one, barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. The plaster on the wall beside it was cracked and peeling from the heat. It was a chance. A terrible, dangerous chance. She didn't hesitate. She crawled on her hands and knees, the floor hot beneath her palms. The heat from the debris was intense, a physical blow. She squeezed through the gap, her dress snagging on a piece of exposed metal. She heard it rip. A piece of hot plaster fell, grazing her shoulder. She cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, but she kept moving. She was through. She stood up, shaking, on the other side. The fire was all around her now. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke and orange light. The wallpaper was peeling off in blackened strips. The portraits of long-dead headmasters stared at her with blistered, accusing eyes. She was in the heart of the beast. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Ethan, are you here?" Only the roar of the fire answered. She checked the first door. Music room A. The door was warped from the heat and wouldn't budge. The second door, music room B, was already gone, and the room beyond it was a furnace of orange and black. She ran to the last door. Music room C. The door was closed. A thin line of smoke seeped from under it, but it was less than the others. She grabbed the brass doorknob. It was searing hot. She recoiled, snatching her hand back with a cry. She pulled the sleeve of her dress down over her hand and tried again. The latch was stiff. She put her shoulder into it, pushing with all her might. The door creaked, groaned, and then burst open. The room was filled with smoke, but the fire hadn't taken hold here yet. The heavy velvet curtains and the soundproofing on the walls had kept the worst of it at bay. For now, through the haze, she saw a figure huddled in the far corner, by the window. It was Ethan. He was on the floor, his back against the wall, his knees pulled up to his chest. He wasn't hiding. He was trapped. A heavy wooden beam from the ceiling had fallen, pinning his leg to the floor. His face was pale, streaked with soot, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond anything she had ever seen. The king of Davenport Academy was gone. In his place was just a boy, scared and alone, waiting to die. "Ethan!" she yelled, rushing to his side. He looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. "Abby," he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "What are you doing here? You have to get out." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. She knelt and examined his leg. The beam was massive, an old, solid piece of oak. His leg was trapped beneath it at an awkward angle. She tried to push the beam, but it was like trying to move a mountain. It didn't budge an inch. "It's no use," Ethan said, his voice flat with despair. "It's broken. My leg. I felt it snap." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound. "You need to go? Save yourself." Abby looked around the room, her mind racing. The fire was growing louder, a constant, hungry drumbeat. The smoke was getting thicker, stealing the air from their lungs. They had minutes, at best. She saw the heavy, floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains. She saw the grand piano in the center of the room. She saw the sturdy metal music stands. "Never see a thing for what it is," her great-grandfather had written. "See it for what it can be. A rock can be a weapon. A rope can be a ladder. A piano can be a lever." "The piano. The piano," she said, her eyes lighting up with a desperate idea. "We can use the piano." Ethan stared at her as if she were insane. "What are you talking about? We need to lift this beam." "We will," she said. She ran to one of the heavy metal music stands. It was cast iron, solid and heavy. She dragged it over to the beam. "Help me." Together, they wedged the base of the music stand under the edge of the fallen beam. It was a makeshift fulcrum. Now they needed a lever. Abby ran to the window. The heavy velvet curtains hung from a thick, solid brass rod. She pulled at the fabric, tearing it away until the rod was exposed. It was held in place by two heavy brackets. She climbed onto the windowsill and kicked at the first bracket. It was screwed into the old plaster wall. The wood around it was hot and brittle. On her third kick, the screws ripped free. The one end of the rod sagged. She moved to the other bracket and did the same. The heavy brass rod crashed to the floor with a clang that was barely audible over the roar of the fire. It was heavy, but together they could handle it. She and Ethan dragged the rod across the room. They slid one end over the music stand and worked the other end under the heavy oak beam. It was a crude, desperate machine. A lever and a fulcrum. "Okay," Abby panted, her lungs screaming for air. "When I say 3, we push down. All our weight." Ethan looked at her, his eyes full of a dawning, incredulous respect. He nodded, his jaw set. "1," Abby said. The fire breached the door, and a wave of superheated air washed over them. 2. A section of the ceiling collapsed in the far corner of the room, showering them with sparks. 3. They threw all their weight onto the end of the brass rod. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The oak beam was immense, a dead weight of centuries-old wood. Then, with a groan of protesting metal and splintering wood, the beam lifted. It rose only a few inches, but it was enough. "Now," Abby screamed, "pull your leg out." Now, with a guttural cry of pain, Ethan wrenched his leg free. The moment he was clear, they released their hold on the rod. The massive beam crashed back down to the floor, shaking the entire room. Ethan tried to stand, but his leg buckled beneath him. The pain was blinding. Abby didn't hesitate. She threw his arm over her shoulders, taking his weight. He was much bigger than her, and the effort was immense. She staggered, but she did not fall. "We have to go," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "This way." She half-dragged, half-carried him out of the music room and back into the hallway, which was now a raging tunnel of fire. The path they had come in was gone, consumed by the inferno. The ceiling was collapsing in sections. Burning embers rained down around them like deadly snow. There was no way forward, no way back. They were trapped between two walls of fire, in a collapsing building, with the smoke stealing the last of their air. The whisper of trouble had become a deafening roar, and the path had finally, terrifyingly, disappeared. The world had been reduced to a roaring, blistering chaos. The hallway was a throat of fire, swallowing the air, the light, the very possibility of survival. Every breath was a gamble, a searing intake of smoke and ash that felt like swallowing glass. Ethan sagged against Abby, his larger frame a dead weight. The initial shock of his injury was giving way to a pain-induced delirium. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow and ragged. "It's over," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former arrogance. "We're not getting out." Abby's own hope was a guttering candle flame in a hurricane. The heat was a physical presence, a giant hand pressing down on them, squeezing the life out. The skin on her face felt tight and hot, as if she were standing too close to a bonfire. The roar of the flames was inside her head now, a deafening, endless wave of sound. It was easy to believe him. It was easy to give up, to lie down and let the fire take them. But her great-grandfather had faced worse. He had been trapped behind enemy lines, in a frozen forest, with no food and no hope. He hadn't given up. He had written about it in his journal, his script precise even as he described the gnawing hunger and the bone-deep cold. Despair is the easiest path. It is a warm blanket that smothers you. You must refuse it. You must stand up in the cold and take one more step, and then another. The act of moving is an act of defiance. And life is defiance. Abby's eyes, red-rimmed and streaming, darted around the fiery corridor. She wasn't looking for a door. She was looking for a weakness, a flaw in the monster that was trying to consume them. The walls were old lath and plaster, covered in thick, academic wallpaper. To her right, the wall bowed inward, the plaster cracking and falling away in superheated chunks. Behind it, she saw a dark void. It was the space between the walls, the service cavity that held the building's old wiring and plumbing. An unmapped, forgotten space. It wasn't a path. It was a hole, a crawl space, a tomb. But it was also a way through. The wall, she gasped, pointing. We can go through the wall. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression blank. It's a wall, Abby. No, she insisted, her voice gaining a strange, fierce clarity. It's a door. She dragged him toward the weakened section of the wall. The heat radiating from it was immense. She braced herself and kicked at the plaster. It crumbled, hot and dusty, revealing the wooden laths beneath. They were old, dry, and already beginning to smolder. She kicked again, and then again, her small body fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-fed strength. A section of the lath splintered and broke. It was enough. She pushed Ethan toward the opening. Get in. You have to crawl. He stared at the dark, narrow hole. It was filled with dust, cobwebs, and the ghosts of 100 years of neglect. But it was also shielded, for the moment, from the direct heat of the fire. He hesitated. Go! Abby screamed, her voice cracking. A section of the ceiling above them tore loose with a sound like a cannon shot. That was the only motivation he needed. Ethan scrambled through the opening, his injured leg dragging uselessly behind him. The pain made him cry out, but he didn't stop. Abby pushed him from behind, forcing him deeper into the darkness. As soon as he was clear, she squeezed in after him, just as the entire ceiling in the hallway collapsed in a roaring avalanche of fire and debris. They were in utter blackness. The roar of the fire was muffled now, a distant, angry beast. The air was still thick with smoke, but it was cooler. Dust choked her, the ancient, undisturbed dust of the Academy's bones. The space was tight, a narrow channel between the hot plaster of the hallway and the cool, solid brick of the building's exterior shell. It smelled of decay and roasted wood. Abby could hear Ethan's ragged breathing just ahead of her. She could feel the vibrations of his coughing through the floor. They were alive. They had defied the fire. For now, I can't see, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. I can't see anything. You don't need to see, Abby said, her own voice calmer than she felt. She was channeling the old soldier now. She was becoming a creature of the night. You need to feel. Crawl. Stay close to the brick wall on your left. It's the outside wall. It will lead us away from the fire. She put a hand on his ankle, a point of contact in the suffocating darkness. I'm right behind you. Just keep moving. And so they began their slow, agonizing journey. It was a primal kind of movement, a regression to the most basic form of locomotion. They crawled on their hands and knees through a space that was never meant for human passage. Splinters from the rough-hewn floorboards dug into Abby's palms. The dust was a constant irritant, a thick, gritty coating in her mouth and throat. Every few feet, they had to navigate around thick, cloth-wrapped electrical conduits and old iron pipes. Ethan was in agony. Every movement was a fresh wave of pain from his broken leg. He grunted and moaned, but he did not stop. The boy who had sneered at her worn book was now following her every instruction, his life utterly dependent on the small, determined girl crawling behind him. The fire was their pursuer. They could hear it, a constant, menacing presence on the other side of the plaster wall. Sometimes, the wall would glow a dull, angry red, and they would feel a wave of heat wash over them. In those moments, They crawled faster. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the darkness, the pain, and the slow, desperate crawl toward an unknown destination. Abby's world shrank to the space directly in front of her face, to the feel of the rough wood beneath her hands and the sound of Ethan's labored breathing. She kept her great-grandfather's words in her mind, a shield against the encroaching despair. Your body can go further than your mind thinks possible. The mind gives up first. It whispers that you are tired, that you are hurt, that you should rest. You must teach your mind to be quiet. You must teach it to obey the will to live. Her own body was screaming in protest. Her muscles ached. Her shoulder, where the hot plaster had grazed her, was a searing point of pain. Her throat was raw, her lungs on fire. But she did not stop. She couldn't. Her will was now tied to Ethan's. She was the engine, and he was the cargo. If she stopped, they would both die in this dusty, forgotten tomb. After what felt like an eternity, she felt a change in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible coolness. And a new smell. Not smoke, not dust. It was the smell of damp earth and old stone. They had reached the foundation of the building. They had crawled the entire length of the West Wing, 100 feet of darkness and pain. "We're getting close," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. The crawl space began to slope downward. Up ahead, she saw a faint, grayish light. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Look," she said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Light. The light was coming from a small, grime-covered grate set into the foundation wall. It was an old coal chute, long since sealed and forgotten. It led to the outside. It led to life. Ethan saw it too, and he was filled with a renewed, frantic energy. He clawed his way toward it, dragging his broken leg behind him. He reached the grate and pushed. It was heavy, cast iron, and rusted shut. He pushed again, with a guttural roar of effort and frustration. It didn't move. "It's stuck," he cried, his voice breaking with despair. He slumped against the wall, his brief flicker of hope extinguished. "It's rusted shut." He began to cough, a deep, racking spasm that left him breathless. Abby crawled up beside him. She examined the grate. He was right. It was fused to its frame by decades of rust and neglect. They were so close. They could hear the distant, muffled sound of sirens. They could smell the clean, smoke-free air on the other side. They were looking at the world through a dirty, barred window they could not open. It was the cruelest kind of trap. Hope, followed by absolute failure. Abby felt a wave of dizziness. The smoke, the exertion, the lack of oxygen, it was all catching up to her. Her vision began to tunnel. The edges of her consciousness grew fuzzy. This was it. They had made it all this way, only to die at the very edge of salvation. As she slumped against the cool stone of the foundation, her hand brushed against something hard and metallic. It was a pipe, an old, iron water pipe that ran along the base of the wall. And on the pipe, there was a valve wheel, coated in rust, but solid. Her mind, foggy with exhaustion, latched onto it. A wheel, a tool. Never see a thing for what it is. See it for what it can be. She didn't have the strength to turn the wheel, but she didn't need to. Her great-grandfather's words came back to her, a final, crucial piece of wisdom from a long-dead soldier. Sometimes, the most direct solution is not about force. It is about changing the conditions. You cannot break a frozen lock, but if you can melt the ice. She didn't have fire, but she had water. "The pipe?" she whispered, her voice so faint it was barely a sound. "The valve." She gripped the rusted wheel with both hands. It was cold and unyielding. She closed her eyes and poured every last ounce of her remaining strength into one, final, desperate act. She pulled. Her muscles screamed. Black spots danced in her vision. The world tilted on its axis. But she did not let go. There was a groaning, protesting screech of metal on metal. The valve, frozen for half a century, moved. It turned a quarter of an inch. And then another. Deep within the wall, there was a shudder. A low gurgle. The old pipe, which had been dry for decades, was suddenly charged with a sudden, violent pressure. It buckled, groaned, and then, right at the joint where it met the exterior wall, it burst. A torrent of cold, rusty water erupted into the crawl space. It wasn't a leak, it was a deluge. It blasted against the foundation wall, hitting the rusted grate with the force of a fire hose. The shock of the cold water on the hot, brittle metal was too much. With a sharp crack, the rusted hinges of the grate shattered. The heavy iron door flew open, and a rectangle of glorious, beautiful daylight flooded the dark space. They were out. Or at least, the way was out. The crawl space was rapidly filling with water. Abby grabbed Ethan, pulling him toward the opening. He was dazed, his body limp. She shoved him through the hole, and he tumbled out onto a muddy patch of overgrown grass behind the school. Abby crawled out after him, gasping, choking, and blinking against the sudden, painful brightness of the sun. She lay on her back, her chest heaving, her body screaming with 1,000 different kinds of pain. The sky above her was a perfect, brilliant blue, streaked with the angry black smoke that was still pouring from the ruins of the West Wing. She could hear shouting, the roar of fire engines, the frantic symphony of a disaster in full swing. But for a moment, all that mattered was the feel of the cool, damp earth beneath her and the taste of clean, fresh air in her lungs. She had done it. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side. She had brought the king of Davenport Academy with her. And in doing so, she had changed everything. For a few precious seconds, there was only the sky and the air. Then the world came rushing back in a cacophony of sound and motion. A firefighter in full gear was the first to reach them, his face a mixture of astonishment and relief behind his oxygen mask. He shouted something into his radio, his voice muffled and urgent. Almost immediately, they were surrounded. Paramedics, their faces grim and focused, descended with a stretcher and a flurry of medical equipment. They swarmed around Ethan, their movements a practiced, efficient ballet. Questions were fired at him. Can you hear me? What's your name? Where does it hurt? He tried to answer, but his words were lost in a fit of coughing. One of the paramedics gently placed an oxygen mask over his face. Another began cutting away his soot-covered pant leg to assess the damage to his leg. Through the haze of his pain, Ethan's eyes searched for Abby. He found her. She was being helped to her feet by a female paramedic who was trying to wrap a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. He reached a hand out toward her, a silent, desperate gesture of connection. Abby saw it. She took a step toward him, but the paramedic gently held her back. Let's give them some room, sweetie. We need to take a look at you, too. The world began to spin in slow motion. Abby felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie of her own life. She was aware of the paramedic checking her pulse, shining a little light in her eyes, asking her questions she couldn't quite process. Her mind was a fog of smoke and exhaustion. All she could hear was the roar of the fire, a sound that seemed to be permanently etched into her memory. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. The sharp, imperious blast of a car horn. A sleek, black limousine, the kind of car that doesn't so much drive as it arrives, had plowed through the emergency cordon, scattering firefighters and police officers like pigeons. It screeched to a halt on the manicured lawn, leaving deep, angry ruts in the perfect grass. The driver's door opened, and a man in a chauffeur's uniform scurried out. He ran to the rear door and opened it with a practiced, deferential flourish. Richard Davenport emerged. He was exactly as Abby had always pictured him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her mother earned in a year, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He moved with an aura of absolute command, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at the burning building, a multi-million-dollar asset that was currently going up in smoke. He didn't look at the frantic efforts of the fire crews. His eyes, cold and gray like a winter sea, scanned the crowd of evacuated students and staff until they found their target. The paramedics, the stretcher, and the boy lying on it. He strode toward the scene, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the soft, wet grass. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark, and the crowd of emergency personnel seemed to part before him instinctively. He stopped beside the stretcher and looked down at his son. It was not the look of a concerned father. It was the look of an engineer assessing a piece of damaged machinery. "What is the extent of the damage?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He was speaking not to Ethan, but to the paramedic who was carefully splinting his leg. The paramedic, a man in his 50s with a kind, weathered face, looked up, momentarily taken aback by the man's cold demeanor. "He has a compound fracture of the tibia and fibula," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Severe smoke inhalation, and some second-degree burns on his hands and arms. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Richard Davenport's gaze flickered over Ethan's burns, his broken leg, the oxygen mask on his face. He didn't say, "Will he be okay?" He didn't say, "Thank God he's alive." He looked at his son, his heir, the future of the Davenport Empire, and he said one word. A word that dripped with a terrifying, Arctic contempt. How? Ethan, who had been watching his father with a kind of desperate, pleading hope in his eyes, flinched as if he had been struck. He pulled the oxygen mask away from his face. "Dad, the fire." "The fire did not break your leg," Richard said, his voice slicing through the air like a shard of glass. "This is a failure, an unacceptable failure of judgment. You were supposed to be in the library, studying for your physics midterm. Instead, you are found in a part of the building that has been off limits for months, with a self-inflicted injury. Explain yourself." The paramedics and firefighters exchanged shocked, disbelieving glances. They were witnessing a level of cruelty that was more shocking than the fire itself. "It wasn't his fault," a small voice said. Richard Davenport turned. For the first time, he seemed to notice the small, soot-covered girl standing beside the ambulance, wrapped in a gray blanket. He looked at her with a blank, dismissive expression, as if she were a piece of stray litter that had blown onto his property. "Who is this?" he asked, his question directed at the air itself. It was the female paramedic who answered. "This is the girl who saved him, sir. She pulled him out." Richard's gaze settled on Abby. He scrutinized her from head to toe, his eyes lingering on her torn and dirty dress, her bare feet, her face streaked with soot and tears. There was no gratitude in his expression, no admiration, only a cold, calculating assessment. He saw not a hero, but a complication, a loose thread in his perfectly woven world. "You are Carol's daughter," he stated. It wasn't a question. He had a file in his head for everyone who worked for him, a mental ledger of assets and liabilities. Abby, he had always classified as a nonentity, a silent, peripheral part of the housekeeping staff. Abby swallowed, her throat dry and raw. "The ceiling fell," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "A beam trapped his leg. He would have died if I hadn't found him." Richard's eyes narrowed. He looked from Abby to his son and back again. He was processing the information, not as a story of heroism, but as a series of inconvenient data points. His son, the heir to $1 billion fortune, had been saved by the housekeeper's daughter. It was a narrative he could not control. It was messy. It was unseemly. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He turned his attention back to Ethan. "So, not only did you disobey my direct instructions, not only did you fail your physics exam, you also demonstrated a level of incompetence so profound that you had to be rescued by a child." Each word was a carefully aimed blow. Ethan, already broken and in pain, seemed to shrink on the stretcher. The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a familiar, soul-crushing shame. Abby felt a surge of something she had never felt before. It wasn't fear. It was anger. A hot, righteous anger that burned away the last of her exhaustion. "He was trapped," she said, her voice louder now. "Anyone would have been trapped. It wasn't his fault." Richard Davenport turned his full, icy attention on her. "You will be silent," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "You are the help. You do not speak unless spoken to." Just then, another figure broke through the crowd. It was Carol Foster, Abby's mother. Her face was pale with terror, her eyes wide and frantic. She had been at the other end of the campus, supervising the cleaning of the gymnasium, when she had heard the news. She ran to Abby, her arms wrapping around her daughter in a fierce, protective embrace. "Oh, Abby, my baby," she sobbed, holding her tight. "Are you all right? I was so scared." She pulled back and examined her daughter, her hands fluttering over the burns and scrapes, her eyes full of a mother's terrified love. "I'm okay, Mom," Abby whispered, leaning into her mother's embrace, the familiar scent of lavender and clean linen a comforting anchor in the swirling chaos. Carol looked up and saw Richard Davenport watching them, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Her body stiffened. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a different kind of fear, the deep, ingrained fear of an employee for a powerful and unpredictable employer. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am so sorry. I don't know what she was thinking. I told her to stay out of the way." Richard said nothing. He simply looked at Carol, and then at the daughter she was holding. He was putting the pieces together. The disobedient son. The heroic maid's daughter. The potential for a story that would paint his family in a weak, unfavorable light. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a gold pen. He uncapped the pen with a soft, expensive click. He wrote quickly, his movements precise and economical. He tore the check from the book and held it out. Not to Abby, the girl who had saved his son's life, but to her mother. A bonus, Richard Davenport said, his voice flat and businesslike. For your trouble, and for your silence. This incident is a private family matter. I trust you will ensure your daughter understands that. She will not speak of this to anyone. Not the press. Not the school. No one. Is that clear? The paramedics, the firefighters, even Ethan, stared at the check. It was a piece of paper, but it was also a gag order. It was a price tag. It was a dismissal. It was the final, stunning, and utterly cold-hearted reaction of a man who saw the world not in terms of people, but in terms of transactions. He wasn't rewarding a hero. He was buying a problem and making it go away. Carol stared at the check in his outstretched hand. Her face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, and a dawning, terrible understanding. She looked at her daughter, covered in soot, her small body trembling with exhaustion and shock. She looked at the billionaire, his face impassive, his hand steady. She looked at the check, a piece of paper that represented more money than she made in a year. A piece of paper that was meant to buy her daughter's courage and erase it from the world. The choice she made in that moment would be as important as the one her daughter had made in the heart of the fire. The entire world of Davenport Academy, with all its power and its privilege, held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Carol Foster looked at the slip of paper. It was neatly printed, the amount written in a confident, masculine script. It was enough money to fix the transmission in her old car. It was enough to buy a new winter coat, the kind that didn't let the wind cut through to the bone. It was enough to stop worrying, just for a little while, about the bills that piled up on her small kitchen table. It was a key to a slightly easier life. Then she looked at her daughter. Abby was watching her, her blue eyes wide and serious. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She was just watching, with a quiet strength that seemed impossibly old for a 12-year-old. In her daughter's soot-streaked face, Carol saw not a victim, but a victor. She saw a girl who had walked through hell and emerged, not just alive, but whole. Abby had done something brave and true, something that could not be measured in dollars and cents. To accept the check would be to tell her that it could. It would be to tell her that her courage had a price tag, and that this man, with his cold eyes and his endless money, had the right to set it. Carol thought of the generations of women in her family who had worked hard, kept their heads down, and accepted what the world gave them. She had always believed that was the only way to survive. To be invisible. To cause no trouble. But her daughter had just taught her a different lesson. She had taught her that sometimes, the only way to survive is to become visible. To stand up. To be trouble for the people who believe the world belongs to them. Slowly, deliberately, Carol raised her hand. Not to take the check, but to gently push Richard Davenport's hand away. Her fingers, chapped and clean from a lifetime of hard work, brushed against his manicured ones. It was a small, quiet gesture, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. "We don't need a bonus, Mr. Davenport," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight of newfound steel. "My daughter did not save your son for a reward. She did it because it was the right thing to do." Richard Davenport's face, for the first time, registered an emotion, disbelief. It was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker in his cold gray eyes, but it was there. He was a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price. The concept of an action motivated by simple decency was as foreign to him as a language from another planet. He looked at Carol as if she had just sprouted a second head. "I believe you misunderstand the situation," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is not a negotiation." "No, sir. It's not," Carol agreed. "My daughter is not for sale." Before Davenport could respond, another voice cut in. It was the battalion chief, a man with a grizzled face and a chest full of medals, who had been quietly observing the scene. "Is this the young lady who went back inside?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of authority. He looked at Abby, and his eyes, unlike Davenport's, were full of a deep and profound respect. "Yes, Chief," the female paramedic answered. She pulled him out of the West Wing just before the roof went. By herself. The fire chief took a step forward, his heavy boots sinking into the grass. He stood between the Fosters and Richard Davenport, a physical barrier of solid, unassuming authority. He knelt down, so he was eye level with Abby. "That was the bravest thing I've seen in 30 years on the job, little one," he said, his voice gentle. "You have the heart of a real hero." He then looked over his shoulder at Richard Davenport. "And your father's reaction, young man," he said, his gaze shifting to Ethan on the stretcher, "should be one of gratitude, not an interrogation." It was at that moment that the final, unexpected twist occurred. Ethan, who had been lying on the stretcher, a silent and shamed observer, pushed himself up onto his elbows. The pain from his leg was immense, but the pain in his soul was greater. "He's not a hero," Ethan said, his voice hoarse but clear. He looked directly at the fire chief, but his words were meant for his father. "My great-uncle, the one the library is named after. He wasn't a hero." Richard Davenport's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. "Ethan, be silent." "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "You name the whole Davenport wing after him. You tell everyone he died in the war, a hero saving his men. It's a lie." The fire chief looked from the boy to the billionaire, a flicker of understanding in his old eyes. He had seen this kind of family drama play out 100 times, in mansions and in trailer parks. The truth always had a way of coming out in a crisis. "My mother told me the real story," Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength. "He didn't die in battle. He died in a training accident. A stupid, pointless accident. He was cleaning his rifle, and it went off. He was clumsy. He was scared. He never even saw combat. You invented the whole hero story because you were ashamed. Because you thought the truth wasn't good enough for the Davenport name." Richard Davenport was speechless. His carefully constructed world, his legacy built on a foundation of curated lies, was being dismantled in front of an audience of paramedics and firefighters by the very heir he had tried to mold in his own image. Ethan's gaze shifted to Abby. His eyes, for the first time, were clear of arrogance and fear. They were filled with a raw, painful, and deeply sincere awe. "You want to see a hero, Dad?" he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Look at her. She's 12 years old. Her mother cleans the toilets. She has nothing. And she walked into a burning building to save my life. She didn't do it for a plaque or a story. She did it because she's better than us." He fell back onto the stretcher, exhausted and spent, the truth having taken every last ounce of his strength. A profound, echoing silence fell over the small group. The paramedics carefully lifted the stretcher and began carrying Ethan toward the waiting ambulance. As they passed Richard Davenport, he didn't even seem to see them. He was staring at the space where his son had been, his face pale, his perfect composure finally, irrevocably shattered. The fire had not just destroyed a wing of his school. It had burned down the very foundation of his life, revealing the hollow, rotten core beneath. 1 week later, Abby sat in her usual corner of the Davenport Academy library, or what was left of it. The main reading room had survived, but it smelled of smoke and chemical cleaners. The West Wing was a blackened, skeletal ruin, visible through the tall, arched windows. The school was closed for repairs, but Carol had been called in to supervise a special cleaning crew, and Abby had come with her. She was holding her great-grandfather's journal in her lap. She had read it cover to cover 3 times in the past week. His words were no longer just stories. They were a part of her. A figure appeared at the end of her table. It was Ethan. He was on crutches, his leg in a massive cast covered in signatures. He moved awkwardly, but his face was different. The arrogance was gone. The fear was gone. He looked younger, and at the same time, much older. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a long moment. Then, he placed a book on the table in front of her. It was a brand new, leather-bound volume. A physics textbook. I thought you might need this more than me," he said, a faint, embarrassed flush on his cheeks. "I'm not coming back here. I'm transferring to the public high school next semester." Abby looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I want to be somewhere real," he said. He looked around the vast, empty library. "This place, it's not real. It's a story my father told himself. I need to find my own story." He paused, then looked her directly in the eye. "Thank you, Abby. You didn't just save my life. You saved me." He turned and began to hobble away. "Ethan," Abby called out. He stopped and looked back. My great-grandfather, she said softly. He wasn't a general or a decorated officer. He was just a sergeant. He was scared all the time. But he said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. A real smile, not a smirk. I think I'd like to read that journal of yours sometime. I'd like that, Abby said. As he walked away, Abby opened the physics textbook. On the inside cover, in a messy, boyish scrawl, he had written a single sentence. To Abby, the girl who understands the true nature of friction and momentum. And courage. She looked out the window at the burned-out shell of the West Wing. It was a scar on the face of the perfect academy. But it was also something else. It was a monument. Not to a fake hero, but to a real one. A reminder that the biggest fires are not the ones that burn down buildings, but the ones that burn away the lies we tell ourselves. And that sometimes, the only person who can lead you out of the smoke is the one you never saw at all. The quiet girl in the corner of the library, who knew how to listen for the whisper of trouble, and had the courage to answer its call. And that's where we'll end the story for now. What did you think of this journey? Have you ever experienced something similar, or discovered hidden meaning in an unexpected place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. I truly enjoy hearing your own stories. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. There are so many more inspiring journeys waiting to be told. Tell me, where are you watching from today? Remember, the people around us often carry extraordinary gifts we might never expect. Sometimes all it takes is someone believing in them. Until next time, keep your heart open to life's little surprises, and thank you for spending this time with me.